Well, welcome to the third week of the course. We'll be talking about this essay here, The Burden and Blessing of Mortality, about a 20th century philosopher, Hans Jonas. And I think that you'll see that in this week's reading and next week's, that the scope kind of widens considerably. I'll tell you what I mean and why I think it widens. If we think about what we've been talking about so far, it's death, considered as the end, the terminus, the limit of a life. And I think that reading Epicurus forces us to make a distinction between death and dying, which is, I'm just defining it here as the process by which a living being is led to death. That is, to make sense of Epicurus, I think we have to make that distinction. That dying is certainly something that we can experience and can have a value for us, whereas death, according to Epicurus, does not, because dying is a part of life. Dying is the end of life. Dying is the last part of life. It's the process by which we're led to the end of life, but it is part of life. The new distinction or the new concept this week is mortality, which changes things quite a bit. It's difficult to talk about death. I don't mean just sort of psychologically or emotionally. Once we start thinking of death merely as the limit of life, it's difficult to even think of it as a thing. It's a limit, and limits are mysterious. Limits, ends, they're concepts that we use to organize our thought about the world, you might say. Physical limits, like the limits of spatial objects, mathematical limits like calculus or something, and temporal limits, limits in time, which is, I think, what death in the Epicurean sense is, reaching a temporal limit, the ending in a time sense. It can be very difficult to nail down, whereas mortality is, I think, easier to talk about, because when we talk about mortality, we're talking about ourselves as we know ourselves now. We know ourselves as mortal creatures. And although it may be difficult to conceptualize just what death is, we all know that we will die. Mortality, defined here as the condition of being the kind of creature that can and will die. So we can begin to talk about how death, insofar as we know it's something that is in all of our futures, whatever it is, how it actually shapes our lives. As we can talk about being mortal creatures. We would be much different beings if we were immortal. So I think that the discussion of mortality, or discussing death in terms of mortality, allows us to bring in a lot more of actual life. So it's a wider scope of discussion. And that's what Jonas, I think, is talking about, is looking at human beings insofar as they are mortals and asking how that shapes us. Although one of the things that he says right away, and this is very important in terms of grasping what he means by the burden of mortality as opposed to the blessing, is that being a mortal is not something that is exclusively human. As he says here in the first page, over this incurably anthropocentric emphasis, not much thought was spent on the obvious truth that we share the lot of mortality with our fellow creatures, that all life is mortal, indeed, that death is coextensive with life. So the burden, as we'll see, the burden of mortality is not something that is exclusively human. It's something that's shared by all organic life, all organisms. And really the burden of mortality is the burden of being an organism rather than being a human organism specifically. I think that when it comes to the so-called blessing of mortality that he discusses at the end of the essay, that's much more specifically and exclusively human. But just to get our bearings here, right, he's saying that the condition of being mortal, the condition of being the kind of creature uh, that can and will die, is both a burden and a blessing. And the burden and blessing are distributed according to the distinction between can die and will die. He says here on the first page, two meanings merge in the term mortal, that the creature, so called, can die, is exposed to the constant possibility of death, and that eventually it must die, is destined for the ultimate necessity of death. So to be mortal, again, as I'm obviously influenced by Jonas here in my definition of mortality, that the can die and the will die are two separate or two distinct things. I mean, to be alive means that you could die at any moment. There's a constant possibility of death, and to be alive means that you will eventually die. That, death is both a constant possibility, as he says, and an ultimate necessity. Now, in the continual possibility, he says, I place the burden of mortality. In the ultimate necessity, I place the blessing of mortality. So we can see right away sort of directions that he's going here. The burden of mortality will consist in the fact that we can die, that death is a continual possibility for us and for every organism. The blessing, he will say, consists in the fact that we will eventually die, that immortality is not a possibility for us, and that's a good thing, he'll argue. I mean, whether or not he's successful, we'll see. So as we look in, I think the more difficult part is definitely grasping the reasons that he says that mortality is a burden rather than a blessing. The arguments are fairly clear cut and simple later in the essay regarding the supposed blessing of mortality. There are a lot, I think, more difficult with regard to why he thinks that mortality is a burden. Again, one of the things you should keep in mind is that the burden is shared equally by all organisms, not specifically a human phenomenon, the burden. So, nowhere in this essay does he say that mortality is a burden for us humans because we worry about death. That we think about death or that we know that we will die. That is not what he's getting at here. He's getting at something quite different. So, it's an easy thought because it maybe goes with some of our established thinking that mortality is a burden because we know we will eventually die, or that's not what he's getting at. The burden is something different, and again, to grasp why mortality is a burden, you have to keep in mind that it's shared by all organisms, not just humans, not just the higher mammals, not just intelligent creatures. It's shared, I suppose, by the simplest one-celled creatures. So I think that that's the thing to keep in mind. I'll try to keep this limited by doing one video on the so-called burden of mortality and one video on the blessing, and sort of leave the rest to you. Sorry, etc.